Hi everyone, it's Mrs. Wallace. How are you? In addition to working on the evaluation of sources, I just wanted to do this brief video to introduce you to some of the land-based empires that we're going to be spending just a short amount of time with, the Ottomans, the Safavids, and the Mughal Empire. Those are some things that we'll look at in the next few days. A couple of things, later in the course, we do look at some sea-based empires. We go back to some of the countries in Europe, for example, Portugal and Spain, where we see the rise of some new monarchs and notably some sea-based empires. So we see the Portuguese, for example, get very involved in Indian Ocean trade, and then also in the Americas. So, the modern country of Brazil, for example, is very connected to the colonization of Portugal. And there is quite a bit of growth in sea-based empires that happens for centuries after the 1450s, so that Renaissance time period really leads into a economic, skyrocketing of some of the European powers. We also have land-based empires. So there's some very significant land-based empires that are also, economic and politically strong and around for multiple centuries. And the Ottomans would be a perfect example of that, the Mughals as well. So land-based empires are unique because they generally are completely on land. Their economic trade routes are generally land-based trade routes, and we are going to see very extensive land-based empires. Land-based empires tend to rely on armies and roads and inland urban areas. And sometimes when we look at the three different land-based empires that we're going to be examining, like the Ottomans, sometimes they get referred to as the gunpowder empires because we start to see, military technology, cannon fire, becoming really maybe important in terms of maintenance of power. But that's the case not only for land-based empires, but also for sea-based empires. So we're just moving into a little bit later in the time frame where we start to see, advancements in military weaponry, and that's going to have an impact on some of the military efforts for some of the empires that we're considering. The Ottomans and the Safavids and the Mughal empires are all distinctly different. They have very, very different priorities and very, very different timelines and, influences. But a couple of things that they have in common that's useful to note. These are all Islamic empires, and notably, some historians will describe these three empires as really igniting almost like an Islamic renaissance of sorts. They are crafted very much with the knowledge of the history of the Islamic Golden Age and the Abbasids and the Umayyads. So even though this is much later in the timeline, and this is not like the Abbasid family, that comes back. The Islamic empires are very connected to the earlier history of the Abbasids, and for example, the city of Baghdad and some of the connection to the Islamic Golden Age are very much part of the inheritance, in a sense, of the Islamic empires. At the same time, we will see distinct differences. The Ottomans, for example, will also be connected to the culture of the Byzantine Empire, at least to some degree, and that's unique to the Ottomans, whereas like the Mughal Empire will be connected to, Hindu culture in India, and that's going to be unique to the Mughal Empire. So each of these, has its distinct cultural influences also. A couple of other things. Each of these empires will really represent the height of Muslim political and military power. The Ottomans will really peak in their territorial growth in the middle of the 1600s, even though the Ottomans, for example, will last as an empire into the time period of World War I and really don't collapse until the 1920s. This is also a group of empires that will counter global European influence. So while we see the extension of these sea-based empires and more European participation in the Indian Ocean trade or in the Americas, we start to see some stoppage on some of that growth, especially in Europe. We really don't see the Ottomans and the Safavids, for example, in the Americas. We're not really going to see an overseas role, but we do see within Europe a great deal of alliances and conflicts, with these Islamic empires. So they are very significant in that regard. We're going to be looking at a lot of art and architecture, a great deal of significant art and architecture. We also will see some degree of decline for each of these empires. They don't decline at the same time for the same reason, but by 1750, most of these empires are in decline to some degree, and the sea-based powers are largely still on the rise in that same time period. So think like the sun never sets on the British Empire, and industrialization really having an impact on some of the sea-based powers. We see a different degree of a timeline for some of these empires that we're looking at, the Ottomans and the Safavids and the Mughals. But let's start with the Ottomans and look at some of the Ottoman empire, at least in its very beginnings. It does begin, and maybe, some context before we look at the map that's on the screen. The map that's on the screen is of, think modern day Turkey, into the area at the time that's sometimes referred to as Anatolia. It's not really a direct match, but a good percentage of Turkey is still, kind of identifiable when we think of Anatolia in a historical sense. But the idea of Turkish groups of people migrating to the area of Anatolia or to the area of the earlier Islamic empires really happens, in the 8 and the 900s. Think of the Mongols essentially as a Central Asian group around the time that the Mongols are really starting to, rise as tribal groups that are competing with each other. We also see the migration of Turkic groups, a variety of Turkic groups. One of these is the Seljuk Turks, which, if you recall, play a role in the decline of the Abbasid Empire in Baghdad. They become instrumental in the political system and then ultimately dominate the political system before the Mongols come to sack Baghdad. The Seljuk Turks are also very significant in grabbing territory from the Byzantine Empire, which is on decline in the time period of the early thousands. The Battle of Manzikert is one example where the Seljuk Turks are successful in grabbing a great deal of land from the Byzantine Empire. So we see throughout the early 1000s this dominance of various Turkic groups who come to migrate or conquer parts of Anatolia, other areas of the former Islamic Empire, and they meet up with a great deal of Christian groups. And in the case of Anatolia, we see Seljuk Turks who are predominantly Muslim, had adapted to the religion of Islam, really kind of creating spaces that are not only Muslim-led, but also become predominantly Muslim. So over time, we see in the case of Anatolia, a great deal of conversions to Islam. And that is some context and history that's already happened by the time we get to the 1300s, right? And so the 1200s and the 1300s, we have a great deal of Turkic groups that are settled in the area of Anatolia, largely Muslim-led groups, but also groups that are not necessarily unified, may culturally be a little bit distinct, and politically are, seen in a variety of different political units that are kind of competing with each other. And the Ottomans are one region of what sometimes gets described as the Beylik period. They're one of the Beyliks. And Osman the First, who often gets credit for being really significant in initiating the rise of the Ottomans, is, this leader who is able to kind of unify various groups behind him and is able to push the Ottomans, into a rise. And so we'll look at a video tomorrow in class that gives some detail about that. But the Ottomans initially are not a massive empire. It's a small nomadic group of Turks who are able to rise and unify other groups of Turkish people who then become kind of connected and followers of the Ottomans. And we see over the course of time, the Ottomans will conquer territory in Eastern Europe. They will enter into not only, the area of Constantinople, which they will conquer effectively. They will enter into areas of Hungary. They will ultimately gain territory in the Balkans. So think like Serbia. They will gain territory in Arab states. So think like Egypt. So there's quite a bit of territory that the Ottomans will grab. They will get checked at the gates of Vienna. But something to know about the Ottoman Empire as it grows, over time, and again, it'll peak in the 1600s. It is incredibly culturally diverse, religiously diverse. It will be very creative in establishing ways to try to unify this like diverse society. Remember, we see something similar in the Habsburg Empire, the Holy Roman Empire, that also creates like a space for Spain and the Spanish Netherlands. So we get this like kind of space in Europe that's incredibly diverse and very difficult to, kind of draw one circle around. The Ottomans potentially have a similar challenge with trying to politically unify a very diverse group of people. It's also a politically sophisticated empire, so we're going to see a lot of very sophisticated political rule and a great deal of urban center. So we'll look at some cities that become very, very significant cities. And this will be one of the most powerful empires in the time period that we've been studying, the 14, 15, and 1600s. European countries that are led by new monarchs are going to be very small potatoes at this time period. Things will change by the 17 and 1800s, but in the 15 and 1600s, Europeans are much, much smaller entities, and it's really the Ottoman Empire, the Inca in the Americas, the Qing Dynasty in China, that are really going to dominate, global politics and global economy. Okay, if you look at the image on the right in 1683, where you see the dark green, that's directly administered territory for the Ottoman Empire, and it's significant because you can see all around the Mediterranean Sea. You can see the modern day cities of Damascus and Jerusalem and Aleppo. You can see the city of Cairo, for example, so into Egypt. You can also see the city of Belgrade, so into the area of the Balkans. So quite a few very extensive cities, and the area of light green becomes at 1683 vassal or autonomous territories that are essentially underneath the Ottomans. So very, very extensive, and that is very significant. You can also see, a difference between 1683 and 1914, which is the beginning in Europe of World War I. We don't really see the Ottoman Empire end until the 1920s, but it's really its participation in the World War on the side of the Central Powers, basically on the side of Germany, and that will challenge the last parts of the Ottoman Empire, and we'll see the beginnings of the country of Turkey at that time in the 1920s. But if you look at this map, you can see in the brown, anywhere that you see brown, light brown or dark brown, that's that 1683 empire that's very, very large, including, Greece and parts of Crimea and parts of Armenia and Anatolia and Tripoli in Libya and places like that. You might also notice by 1914 that the Ottoman Empire has shrunk. So over the course of its lifetime, it will get much smaller and is much more in decline by the time of the 17 and 1800s, and definitely by 1914, where we see primarily Anatolia and some of the areas around some of the religious significant